Welcome back to this continuing series on Socrates and Plato. This video builds directly on our earlier discussions of apology, crito, euthyphro, and the Phaedo. Here, we bring those conversations together to examine how Plato develops a deeper account of the soul, connecting Socrates' defense, his moral choices, and his method of inquiry to questions of immortality, truth, and the philosophical meaning of life and death. Before we begin examining individual arguments, it is important to be clear about what this session is actually trying to accomplish. The aim here is not simply to present Plato's claims and move on, nor is it to assume in advance that those claims succeed. What is at stake is a carefully balanced philosophical exercise with two parallel goals that must be kept in view at the same time. On the one hand, we will work to understand, as clearly and charitably as possible, the arguments offered in the Phaedo for the immortality of the soul. These arguments are complex, interconnected, and deliberately staged. Plato does not throw them out casually, and they deserve to be reconstructed with precision. Each one is meant to illuminate a different feature of the soul, its relation to change, to knowledge, to composition, and to life itself. Treating these arguments seriously means allowing them to speak in their strongest form before passing judgment on them. At the same time, the inquiry has a second and equally important aim. We are not here merely to repeat Plato's conclusions, but to test whether the arguments succeed on their own terms. Crucially, the pressure does not come primarily from external criticism or from modern philosophical assumptions. It comes from questions and worries that arise within the dialogue itself. Plato does not present any argument as final or immune to challenge. Each one is followed by hesitation, counterexamples, or explicit objections raised by the interlocutors. The task, then, is to see how far the arguments really go, and where they fall short, given the standards Plato himself seems to accept. This structure is not accidental. The progression throughout the dialogue follows a consistent pattern. An argument is introduced, its conclusion is drawn, and then its weaknesses are exposed. No argument stands unchallenged. Even the most ambitious reasoning is subjected to scrutiny, either by Socrates himself or by others who take the reasoning seriously enough to resist it. This pattern is philosophically significant. It signals that the inquiry is not about reaching a comforting answer as quickly as possible, but about understanding what can and cannot be justified by reason. Because of this, it would be a mistake to treat the arguments as independent proofs that can be evaluated in isolation. Their force is cumulative and comparative. Each argument corrects, supplements, or reorients the previous one. Early arguments motivate the idea that the soul might survive death, but leave open deep questions about its nature. Later arguments attempt to answer those questions, but only by relying on increasingly demanding metaphysical commitments. Seeing how the discussion unfolds requires keeping track not just of conclusions, but of what each stage assumes and what it leaves unresolved. This is where the theory of forms becomes essential. It is tempting to think of the discussion of forms as background material, something Plato happens to believe and brings along for unrelated reasons. That temptation must be resisted. The arguments about immortality do not merely coexist with the theory of forms, they depend on it. Claims about the soul's persistence, its relation to life, and its resistance to destruction all presuppose a distinction between what is stable and what is subject to change, between what truly is and what merely becomes. Without that framework, the question of immortality would reduce to a biological or psychological issue about the endurance of a process. Plato is asking a different kind of question altogether. Throughout this inquiry, one question will quietly guide everything that follows. It is not simply whether the soul survives death, but what kind of thing the soul must be if it is to survive at all. Is it composite or simple? Is it bound to the body or capable of existing apart from it? Is it more like the things that come to be and pass away, or more like the things that always remain what they are? The answers Plato explores to these questions will determine how persuasive his arguments can be. Keeping that guiding question in view will allow us to see the unity of the discussion, even when individual arguments falter or come under strain. To understand the arguments that will later be offered about the soul, we first need to assemble the conceptual machinery that makes those arguments possible. Plato is not reasoning in a metaphysical vacuum. He's operating with a very specific picture of reality, and unless that picture is brought into focus, the discussion of immortality will appear either unmotivated or confused. This framework is often described as Platonism, though what matters here is not the label, but the set of commitments it names. At its most general level, Platonism is the view that reality includes more than the sensible things we encounter in everyday experience. Alongside particular actions, objects, and persons, there exist abstract entities such as justice itself, equality itself, or beauty itself. These entities are not located in space, they are not visible, and they are not subject to change. Crucially, Plato does not treat them as secondary or derivative. They are not pale reflections of sensible things, nor are they useful fictions invented for the sake of explanation. They are fully real, and in an important sense, more real than the sensible things that participate in them. Their existence does not depend on our thinking about them, talking about them, or agreeing about them. Even if no one ever judged an action to be just, justice itself would still be what it is. This view grows directly out of assumptions already present in Socratic questioning. When Socrates asks, "What is X?" he is not asking for examples. He is not satisfied with being shown a pious action or a courageous deed. He's asking for the object of definition, the nature or essence that makes all pious actions pious or all courageous actions courageous. This object must be one and the same in every case. It must be what different instances have in common, and it must explain why they count as instances at all. If there were nothing common to them, the question, "What is X?" would be incoherent. This leads naturally to the idea of explanatory priority. The form is not derived from the instances. Rather, the instances are what they are because of the form. Actions are not just and then grouped together under the concept of justice. They are just because they stand in a certain relation to justice itself. The form explains the instance, not the other way around. This is why forms also function as standards or ideals. They provide the measure by which we judge whether a particular thing really counts as just or beautiful, and how well it does so. Without such a standard, judgments would collapse into mere comparison between imperfect cases with no fixed point of reference. Once these assumptions are in place, several consequences follow almost immediately. First, no individual sensible thing can serve as a definition. Any particular action or object is too limited, too variable, and too tied to circumstance to capture what is common to all cases. Second, because forms function as standards, they cannot admit their opposites. The form of equality cannot itself be unequal, and the form of justice cannot itself be unjust. Sensible things, by contrast, appear just in one respect and unjust in another, or just at one time and unjust at another. Third, genuine knowledge of instances depends on knowledge of the form. Without grasping what justice is, our claims about just actions remain provisional, based on habit or opinion rather than understanding. From here, Plato draws a sharp distinction between two domains of reality. On the one hand, there is the realm of being. This is the domain of the forms, eternal, unchanging, uniform, and fully what they are. On the other hand, there is the realm of becoming, the sensible world we encounter through perception. Sensible things are constantly changing. They come into being, alter, and pass away. They never simply are what they are without qualification. This distinction is not merely descriptive. It marks a difference in the kind of reality things have. The same division appears when we turn from metaphysics to epistemology. The forms are the proper objects of knowledge. They are grasped by the intellect, and when they are grasped, what results is stable understanding. Sensible things, by contrast, are the objects of belief or opinion. Because they are always in flux, they cannot be known with the same certainty. The senses provide access to appearances, not to what is fully and unchangingly the case. Experience can point us toward the forms, but it cannot, by itself, secure knowledge. This framework also explains how language functions. General terms such as equal, beautiful, or just do not primarily attach to sensible particulars. They name forms. When we say that a particular stick is equal in length to another, or that an action is just, this claim is true only because the sensible thing participates in the relevant form. The form is the equal itself, or the just itself. The sensible thing merely has equality or justice in a derivative way. Plato often marks this difference by distinguishing between what the form is and what sensible things have. The form is F. Sensible things have F-ness by participation. This distinction between F itself and having F-ness will play a crucial role later. At this point, a guiding question should come into focus. Why would a discussion of immortality require this entire metaphysical apparatus? Why can the fate of the soul not be settled by examining biological processes or psychological functions alone? Plato's answer is implicit in everything we have seen so far. Immortality, as he understands it, is not merely continued existence over time. It is persistence of a certain kind, persistence that aligns with what is stable, intelligible, and non-composite. If the soul is to survive the death of the body, it must be the kind of thing that belongs by its nature more to being than to becoming. Without the theory of forms, Plato could not even state what it would mean for the soul to persist. Survival would reduce to the endurance of a bodily process, and death would mark its inevitable end. By introducing forms, Plato creates the conceptual space to ask a different question, whether the soul is akin to the kinds of things that do not come to be and pass away at all. Only within this framework can the later arguments about the soul's immortality be meaningfully formulated. The first sustained attempt to argue for the soul's immortality in the Phaedo is what is commonly called the Cyclical Argument. It appears early in the discussion, and its role is deliberately limited. Plato is not yet trying to show what the soul is like in its nature. Instead, he is asking a more basic question, whether the idea of the soul's existence before and after bodily life is even coherent. The argument is meant to open the possibility of immortality, not to settle it. The starting point is a very general observation about change. Socrates draws attention to pairs of opposites and to the processes that connect them. Things that are larger come to be larger from having been smaller. Things that are weaker become stronger from having been weaker. In each case, there is a transition from one opposite to the other, and that transition is intelligible only because there is a process connecting the two states. Growth connects small and large. Strengthening connects weak and strong. Opposites, Socrates suggests, do not simply appear out of nowhere. They come to be from their opposites through some determinate change. This pattern is then extended beyond ordinary qualities to states such as sleeping and waking. Being awake comes from having been asleep, and falling asleep comes from having been awake. These are not random events. They are stages within a cycle. If waking occurred without ever being followed by sleeping, or sleeping without ever returning to waking, the balance between the two would collapse. The point is not merely descriptive. Socrates is suggesting that the intelligibility of such oppositions depends on their being embedded in a cyclical structure. From here, the argument turns to life and death. Life and death are opposites, just as waking and sleeping are. Living things come to be dead, that much is obvious. But if opposites come to be from opposites, and if death is the opposite of life, then there must also be a process by which the dead come to be alive. If there were only a one-way transition from life to death, then the cycle would break. Everything would eventually end up dead, with no return. The very persistence of living things in the world seems to require that coming to life balance dying, just as waking balances sleeping. This leads to the central claim of the argument. If something comes to life, then it must have existed before coming to life. Coming to be, in this context, is not creation out of nothing. It is a change of state. Just as something that becomes awake must already exist while asleep, something that becomes alive must already exist while dead. On this reasoning, souls must exist prior to birth, and after death as well, undergoing a transition analogous to other cyclical changes. Death, on this view, is not the annihilation of the soul, but a state it can enter and leave. The appeal of this argument lies in its simplicity. It relies on familiar patterns of change, and extends them to life and death. It offers a way of thinking about death that does not involve absolute disappearance. Instead, death becomes one phase within a larger process, a transition rather than an endpoint. In this way, the argument motivates the idea that the soul could survive the death of the body. However, Plato is careful not to let the argument stand unexamined. Almost immediately, serious problems emerge, and these problems reveal how limited the argument really is. The first concerns what the argument actually shows. At best, it seems to establish that there must be something before birth if living beings come to be alive. But does it show that the soul exists after death, or only that it existed before birth? The symmetry the argument relies on may not be as strong as it appears. Coming to be alive from death does not obviously require that the same individual soul persists through death. The argument leaves this crucial point underdetermined. The second problem concerns the principle that nothing comes from nothing. This principle does real work in the argument, but its scope is unclear. It may rule out coming to be out of nothing, but it does not rule out destruction. Something might cease to exist entirely without violating the idea that nothing comes from nothing. The argument assumes that coming to be and ceasing to be are symmetrical processes, both forms of alteration. But this assumption is precisely what is at issue. Why should we think that ceasing to be is anything like becoming cold or falling asleep, rather than a genuine annihilation? This leads to a deeper worry about how death is being understood. The argument treats death as a state the soul can undergo while remaining in existence, just as something can be asleep while still existing. But that is exactly what needs to be shown. If death is instead the destruction of the soul, then there is no subject left to undergo a reverse process. In that case, the cyclical model breaks down. The argument depends on building into the notion of death the very persistence it is supposed to establish. Finally, there is a question about the subject of the cycle itself. Even if we grant that there must be something that exists before birth and after death, why think that this something is an individual soul? The argument moves quickly from abstract patterns of change to a very specific conclusion about personal survival. But it has not yet explained what kind of entity underlies the cycle, or why it should preserve individual identity rather than being some impersonal life principle. Taken together, these difficulties show why this argument cannot bear the full weight of Plato's conclusion. Its real function is preparatory. It loosens the grip of the assumption that death must be final annihilation and introduces the idea that life and death might be phases within a larger process. But it does not yet secure the immortality of the soul in any robust sense. It motivates the inquiry. It does not complete it. This is why Plato immediately turns to further arguments, each designed to answer questions that the cyclical argument leaves unresolved. At this stage, the discussion takes a decisive turn. Up to now, the arguments have focused on when the soul exists, before birth, after death, or within a cycle of coming to be. What Plato now attempts is something more ambitious. He shifts from temporal reasoning to ontological reasoning. The question is no longer simply whether the soul exists at different times, but what kind of thing the soul is, and whether its nature aligns it with what is capable of surviving destruction at all. This shift relies on an assumption that has already been introduced and accepted earlier in the dialogue, the doctrine of recollection. Socrates does not re-argue it in detail here. Instead, he treats it as established. The core claim is that our ability to recognize equality, beauty, or justice as such cannot be explained solely by sense experience. Sensible things are always imperfect and variable, yet we judge them by reference to something stable. This suggests that the soul had prior acquaintance with the forms themselves. Knowledge of the forms, then, implies that the soul existed before embodiment. Recollection secures pre-existence, but by itself, it does not show that the soul is eternal. It tells us that the soul existed before, not that it must always exist. The affinity argument is introduced to fill that gap. Its strategy is comparative rather than cyclical. Instead of asking how the soul moves through different states, it asks what the soul is most like. Socrates proposes that reality can be divided into two broad classes of things. On the one hand are things that are divine, intelligible, uniform, incomposite, and indissoluble. These are invisible, grasped by the intellect, and stable. On the other hand are things that are visible, composite, changing, and destructible. These belong to the sensible world and are subject to coming to be and passing away. This division closely mirrors the earlier distinction between being and becoming. What is new here is the attempt to locate the soul within this framework. Socrates argues that the soul resembles the former class more than the latter. The soul is invisible. It is not perceived by the senses in the way bodies are. It is less variable than the body, capable of maintaining its identity through bodily changes. Most importantly, it rules the body rather than being ruled by it. The body obeys the soul's commands, whereas the soul directs, deliberates, and governs. In this respect, the soul appears closer to what is divine than to what is merely material. From these points, Socrates draws a cautious conclusion. If the soul is more akin to what is intelligible, incomposite, and divine, then it is likely to be indissoluble and deathless. The argument does not claim absolute certainty. Its force lies in plausibility. If things that are composite are liable to be destroyed by coming apart, and if things that are incomposite are not, then the soul's resemblance to the incomposite gives us reason to think it will survive the dissolution of the body. This way of reasoning marks a significant development. Immortality is no longer being defended by appeal to cosmic cycles or balance in nature. It is being grounded in the metaphysical character of the soul itself. If the soul belongs to the same general class of things as the forms, then its fate should resemble theirs rather than that of bodily objects. Yet Plato is acutely aware of how fragile this line of reasoning is, and the notes make clear that serious problems immediately arise. The first is the weakness of analogy itself. Resemblance does not guarantee identity. To say that the soul is invisible or less variable does not by itself show that it is indissoluble or eternal. Similarity in some respects does not entail similarity in all respects, especially in the crucial respect of survival. This leads directly to a second problem. Invisibility does not imply eternity. There are many things that are invisible or incorporeal that nonetheless do not last forever. Socrates himself will soon confront this issue directly when the harmony analogy is introduced. A harmony is invisible, non-material, and fine, yet it depends entirely on the physical structure of the instrument. When the instrument is destroyed, the harmony disappears. The mere fact that something is not bodily does not secure its independence from bodily conditions. A third difficulty deepens this concern. Even if the soul is not composite in the same way a body is, it does not follow that it is incomposite in the relevant sense. There may be different kinds of composition, and not all forms of non-physical existence are immune to destruction. The argument risks moving too quickly from the soul's lack of visible parts to the conclusion that it cannot come apart at all. There is also a more fundamental question about the initial division of reality into two kinds of things. Why should we accept that everything that is invisible and intelligible belongs to the same category as what is divine and eternal? The classification itself is doing much of the argumentative work, but its justification is not fully explained. Without independent support for this division, the inference from affinity to immortality remains insecure. These problems point to the central tension in the argument. Plato is attempting to move from similarity to identity. He begins by saying that the soul is like the divine and intelligible, and he ends by suggesting that it shares their essential properties, including deathlessness. But this move is delicate. If it is pushed too far, it collapses into assertion. If it is held back, it fails to deliver the desired conclusion. The importance of this stage in the discussion lies precisely in this tension. The affinity argument brings into focus what is now at stake. Immortality cannot be established merely by showing that the soul existed before or that it resembles stable things in certain respects. What is needed is a stronger account of why the soul must belong, by its very nature, to the class of things that cannot be destroyed. The failure of simple analogy prepares the ground for the next phase of the inquiry, where Plato will confront directly the possibility that the soul, despite its apparent nobility, might still depend on the body in a way that makes its survival impossible. At this point in the discussion, a serious and philosophically sophisticated objection is raised, one that threatens to undermine much of what has been claimed so far. Simmias proposes an alternative way of understanding the soul, one that preserves many of its attractive features while denying its independence from the body. The force of this objection lies precisely in how reasonable it appears given what has already been said. According to this view, the soul is a kind of harmony or attunement of the bodily elements. Just as a harmony arises when the strings of a lyre are arranged and tensioned in the right way, so the soul arises when the elements of the body are organized in the appropriate proportion. On this picture, the soul is not a crude bodily object. It is invisible, non-material, and fine. It may even seem divine in comparison with the physical constituents from which it emerges. Yet despite this apparent nobility, it remains dependent on the body. When the body is destroyed, the harmony necessarily disappears. The destruction of the instrument entails the loss of the harmony. This proposal is especially dangerous for Plato's position because it accommodates much of what has already been argued. The soul, on this account, can be non-bodily, invisible, and orderly without being capable of surviving death. If this view is correct, then all previous arguments that relied on the soul's invisibility or its superiority to the body lose much of their force. The soul could still be refined and intelligible while being entirely contingent on bodily organization. Socrates responds to this objection with two distinct lines of reasoning, each targeting a different aspect of the harmony theory. The first reply draws directly on the doctrine of recollection, which Simmias himself has already accepted earlier in the discussion. If the soul is a harmony that depends on the body, then it cannot exist before the body. A harmony does not precede the instrument whose harmony it is. Yet recollection implies that the soul existed prior to embodiment, since it had access to the forms before encountering sensible things. If recollection is true, then the harmony theory cannot be. The two views are logically incompatible. This reply is strategically important. Socrates does not introduce a new assumption here. He appeals to a commitment that has already been granted. In doing so, he forces Simmias to choose between two positions that cannot both be maintained. Either the soul pre-exists the body, or it is a harmony produced by bodily organization. If recollection is to be preserved, the harmony theory must be abandoned. However, Socrates does not rest his case there. He offers a second reply that goes deeper into the structure of explanation and causation. Even if we set recollection aside, the harmony analogy fails to capture the actual relation between soul and body. A harmony is something that is governed by the instrument. The tuning of the strings determines which harmonies are possible and which are not. The harmony has no authority over the lyre. It does not command or direct the strings. The soul, by contrast, appears to stand in the opposite relation to the body. It rules and directs bodily activity. It commands, restrains, deliberates, and judges. The body follows the soul's lead rather than the soul being determined by bodily states in the way a harmony is determined by the condition of an instrument. This asymmetry of control matters. If the soul were merely a harmony, it would be an effect of bodily organization, not a governing principle. But the phenomena of agency and deliberation suggest that the soul functions as a source of order, not merely as a result of it. This difference in the direction of causation reveals what is fundamentally at stake. The harmony theory treats the soul as a byproduct of physical arrangement. It may be elegant and refined, but it has no independent power. Plato's conception of the soul requires more than this. The soul must be capable of initiating action, not merely reflecting the state of the body. It must be able to oppose bodily impulses, not simply express them in a different form. A harmony cannot resist the instrument that produces it. The soul can and often does resist the body. The philosophical stakes of this disagreement are significant. If the soul is a harmony, then its fate is sealed with that of the body. When the body disintegrates, the soul vanishes. There is no survival, no persistence, and no sense in which philosophy could be oriented towards something enduring beyond bodily life. Even if the soul is admirable while it lasts, it is ultimately fragile and dependent. Plato's insistence is that this will not do. For the soul to be what philosophy requires it to be, the bearer of knowledge, the source of rational control, and the subject of moral responsibility, it must be more than a finely tuned state of matter. It must be a genuine principle, capable of existing in its own right. The harmony objection forces Plato to sharpen this claim. It exposes the inadequacy of explaining the soul as an emergent effect and prepares the ground for a stronger argument, one that will attempt to show that the soul does not merely resemble what is deathless, but belongs to that category by its very nature. The final stage of the discussion is also the most ambitious. Here Plato offers what is meant to be the strongest case for the soul's immortality, and at the same time he exposes the argument to the greatest philosophical pressure. What is at stake is no longer resemblance, likelihood, or cyclical balance, but necessity. If this argument succeeds, the soul is not merely long-lived or resistant to decay. It is indestructible. The structure of the reasoning draws directly on the metaphysical framework already established. The starting point is a claim about forms themselves. A form never admits its opposite while remaining what it is. The form of cold does not become hot. The form of even does not become odd. If such a change were to occur, the form would either cease to be what it is or be destroyed. In this sense, forms are essentially stable. Their identity excludes the admission of contrary properties. Plato then extends this claim beyond the forms themselves to things that are always associated with a given form. There are sensible things that, whenever they exist, necessarily carry a certain form. Snow, whenever it exists, carries cold. Fire, whenever it exists, carries heat. The number 2, whenever it exists, carries evenness. These things are not identical with a form, but they participate in it in such a way that they never admit the opposite while they exist. Snow does not become hot while remaining snow. If heat approaches, snow does not turn into hot snow. It either retreats or perishes. The key idea is that participation in a form can impose strict limits on what a thing can admit. This pattern prepares the crucial move. The soul, Plato claims, is precisely the kind of thing that always brings a certain form with it. Wherever the soul is present, life is present. The soul is what makes a body alive. This is not an accidental feature. It belongs to the soul's very role. To be a soul is to be that which brings life to whatever it occupies. Once this is granted, the rest of the argument unfolds rapidly. Life has an opposite, and that opposite is death. If the soul is essentially bound up with life, then it cannot admit death any more than snow can admit heat. When death approaches, the soul will not take it on. It will either withdraw or cease to exist. But here Plato presses further. Unlike snow, which can perish when its opposite approaches, the soul is said to be deathless. It does not admit death at all. And if something is genuinely deathless, Plato argues, then it cannot be destroyed. Deathlessness, on this reasoning, entails indestructibility. The conclusion is bold. The soul does not merely survive death in the sense of continuing on for a while. It cannot be destroyed at all. Its nature excludes death, just as the nature of the form of life excludes its opposite. The argument is meant to show that the soul belongs, by necessity, to the class of things that cannot pass away. This is the most tightly integrated argument in the dialogue. It brings together the theory of forms, the distinction between being and becoming, and the account of the soul as the source of life. It also directly addresses the harmony objection. If the soul were merely an attunement of bodily elements, there would be no reason to think it carried life in this strict sense. It would be an effect, not a bearer of a form. By contrast, this argument treats the soul as something whose essence fixes what it can and cannot admit. Yet it is precisely because the argument is so strong that its weaknesses become especially significant. The notes draw attention to several questions that cannot be ignored. The first arises from Plato's own examples. If the form of cold is indestructible, why is snow not indestructible as well? Snow never admits heat. When heat approaches, it disappears. But disappearing is precisely a kind of destruction. Why should the soul not behave in the same way? Why should it not give way when death approaches, rather than persist? This leads directly to a second and deeper worry. Plato needs more than the claim that the soul does not admit death. He needs the claim that it cannot perish. But these are not obviously the same. A thing might be such that it never becomes dead, not because it persists eternally, but because it ceases to exist when death approaches. The argument moves quickly from will not admit death to is indestructible, but that transition is doing an enormous amount of work. The earlier examples do not clearly support it. A third question concerns individuality. Plato insists that there are many souls, not one universal soul shared by all living things. But the argument appeals repeatedly to forms and to what is essentially bound up with them. This raises a subtle issue. If the soul is always the bearer of life in the same way that snow is always the bearer of cold, what distinguishes one soul from another? Does Plato need to think of forms as being in things in a stronger sense to preserve individuality? Or does the argument risk collapsing all souls into a single life principle? These questions expose the deepest tension in the argument. Deathlessness does not obviously entail indestructibility. The move from resisting an opposite to being incapable of perishing altogether is not secured by the examples Plato provides. In trying to guarantee immortality, Plato may be relying on a conception of essence that goes beyond what has been fully justified. And yet, even if the argument does not compel assent, it achieves something philosophically important. It forces the issue into the open. If the soul is to be immortal, it cannot merely resemble what is stable. It must have a nature that excludes death in principle. The final argument shows what such a claim would require. It also shows how demanding that requirement is. What remains at the end of this reasoning is not a simple proof, but a sharpened conception of the soul. The soul is presented as essentially tied to life, as something whose identity is not exhausted by bodily processes. Whether or not we accept the conclusion that it is indestructible, we are left with a clear sense of what Plato thinks must be true if immortality is to be more than a hopeful metaphor. The pressure generated by this argument is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that the question has been pushed as far as Plato can take it within his own framework. As the discussion draws to a close, it becomes possible to see more clearly what Plato has achieved, and just as importantly, what he is not. By this point, it should be evident that the sequence of arguments does not amount to a conclusive demonstration of the soul's immortality. At every crucial stage, questions arise that Plato himself does not fully resolve. Cycles may fail to guarantee survival, resemblance may not secure identity, and even deathlessness may not straightforwardly entail indestructibility. If the standard is a proof that leaves no room for doubt, the dialogue does not meet it. Yet to focus only on that failure would be to misunderstand the philosophical accomplishment of the Phaedo. Plato is not merely stacking arguments in the hope that one of them will succeed. He is gradually reshaping how the soul is to be understood. By the end of the inquiry, the soul has been redefined in ways that fundamentally alter the terms of the question. It is no longer treated as a bodily function, a harmony of material parts, or a transient psychological state. It is presented as something intelligible rather than sensible, something whose nature is grasped by thought rather than perception. This reconception brings with it further commitments. The soul is portrayed as non-composite, or at least is not composed in the way bodies are. It is not something that obviously comes apart when physical structures dissolve. More importantly, it is oriented toward the forms. The soul is the bearer of understanding, the capacity through which the forms are known, remembered, and contemplated. Its deepest activity is not sensation or motion, but reasoning and judgment. Even when the arguments stop short of proving immortality, they succeed in situating the soul within the intelligible order rather than within the realm of mere becoming. Within this framework, immortality takes on a different role. It functions first as a metaphysical hypothesis. It expresses what must be true if the soul really belongs to the same general category as what is unchanging and intelligible. If the soul is akin to the forms, then its persistence beyond bodily life is at least coherent. Immortality is no longer an arbitrary add-on. It follows from a particular picture of what reality is like and where the soul fits within it. At the same time, immortality functions as an ethical demand. The question of whether the soul survives death is inseparable from the question of how one ought to live. If the soul is oriented toward what is stable and intelligible, then a life devoted entirely to bodily pleasure, status, or material success appears misguided. The arguments press the listener to take the soul seriously as something that can be improved or degraded by the way one lives. Whether or not immortality is finally established, the possibility of it transforms the significance of moral and intellectual cultivation. This is why philosophy, in this dialogue, becomes a distinctive kind of practice. It is not merely a set of theories to be accepted or rejected. It is a training of the soul. To philosophize is to loosen one's attachment to the realm of becoming, to what is unstable, fluctuating, and bound to bodily conditions. It is to learn to turn one's attention toward what is stable, intelligible, and constant. In this sense, philosophy prepares the soul to align itself with being rather than with what merely comes to be and passes away. Seen in this light, the limitations of the arguments are not accidental flaws. They reflect the difficulty of the subject matter itself. Plato is pushing reason as far as it will go in addressing questions about life, death, and the nature of the self. The arguments strain because the stakes are high. What emerges is not a final doctrine but a transformed perspective. Even if each argument can be resisted in isolation, together they reorient how the soul is conceived and how a philosophical life is to be lived. The lasting achievement of the dialogue lies here. Plato may not compel us to believe that the soul is immortal, but he compels us to reconsider what the soul is, what it is for, and what it would mean to live as if one's deepest allegiance were to what does not change. In doing so, he reshapes the meaning of philosophy itself, not as the pursuit of comforting conclusions, but as a disciplined attempt to align one's life with what reason presents as most real.